Thank you, everybody. Welcome to Rhode Island, and you're getting a good taste of Rhode Island here. You know, we're the smallest state, but we are the most important state. Because Roger Williams, because those excuse the phrase, batshit crazy preachers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony weren't quite crazy enough for Roger Williams. So in the dark of night, he sneaks over the Seekonk River, an Indian river, and on the point where the Moshassuck River and the Woonasquatucket River meet. And I forgot to ask Silver Moon this, but Woonasquatucket, I believe, means where the tribes meet, where the peoples meet. He formed the Providence and Rhode Island and Providence and the plantations. And then in the 1630s, and then 100 years later, everybody thinks that either 1776 or before that, Lexington conquered the first shot. In Rhode Island, we have this little group called, with Bob Burke, the First Shot Group. The real first hostilities against the Crown were as early as 1772, when another group of batshit crazy Rhode Islanders got on rowboats and went down and set afire the HMS Gaspee, a tax collecting boat, in 1772 that grounded off at what is now Gaspee Point in Warwick, Rhode Island, also on the waters. Stephen, if he did this intentionally, he's a genius. And if he did this unintentionally, he's both a genius and very lucky. You could not have a better curated sequence of presentations. Silver Moon talked about the water and the indigenous people of Rhode Island, the Narragansetts. And our next speaker, Keith Stokes, is going to talk to you about Newport, Rhode Island, famous for many things: America's Cup, the Gilded Age cottages, mansions, and Navy bases, the founding of the U.S. Navy. But Keith's going to focus on some of the ironies of a trade port in the colonial days and its impact on today's conversations about expropriation and of properties and slavery and racism. Let me tell you just a little bit about Keith. We've been friends for 30+ years. Keith is a native of Newport, multi-generational. His family, he can tell you a little bit more about this. He comes from a multiracial but also multi-religious background, including a deep-rooted Jewish background. Keith is as knowledgeable about Judaism and participates at Torah Synagogue as a layperson in ways that we wish many of our fellow Jews actively preserved our past. He's a graduate of Cornell University and the University of Chicago. In our Jewish communities, we pay attention to where people go to school, and higher education is important to our people. So he's well educated. He's also wicked smart, as we say here in Rhode Island. When we first met, Keith was working for and with a former president of Temple Bethel, Bruce Sunland, Rhode Island's second Jewish governor. And he used to refer to Keith as my cousin Keith. And then Keith went on to a distinguished career as the chief executive officer of the Newport Chamber of Commerce, and really built that from a small town chamber to a statewide powerhouse. And in recent years, he's run state agencies, municipal agencies. He's a historian and educator today, predominantly also working as a consultant for many different business and education groups. But his biggest skill set, you're going to see this today, is you may remember President Obama used to not understand why some people didn't understand what he wanted to do for policy reasons. And he'd say, I wish I could do like Bill Clinton did. He was the explainer in chief. Keith is a gifted explainer of public policy. Not an easy thing to do. Stephen knows this from his work. To take complicated economic development policy or tax policy and break it into bite-sized components so legislators predominantly could understand it is my favorite skill set at Keith's. He's lectured many times. I've been to a bunch of his talks on race and history in Rhode Island, and you're in for a real treat. Welcome, Keith Stokes.
Well, thank you, Rob. Rob and I do go back over 30 years. I think we've had a hand in nearly all the major economic development projects in the last 30 years across the state. So he and I have commiserated many times in trying to move public policy and invest in the state.
We have denied that under oath.
Absolutely, absolutely have. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Welcome to Rhode Island, welcome to Providence, to Newport, particularly. As Rob said, I'm a native Newporter. In fact, my kids, my young adult kids, are 11th generation on a maternal side. My maternal grandmother was a part of the earliest Sephardic Jews to arrive from Curaçao to Barbados to Newport in the 17th century. In 1903, she converted, married my grandfather, and became an Episcopalian. So we've been, since 1903, members of the Episcopal Church in Newport, but I've been on the board of Turtle Synagogue Foundation, been chair of the Education Committee, president of the foundation for about the last 30 years. So even though we outmarried in very early part of the 20th century, we still stayed very connected culturally, even religiously, and certainly historically. And I've had the opportunity of having this family, of actually owning heirlooms, Judaic heirlooms that date back to the 18th century. So it's been interesting for me to grow up in a community that is so vested and rooted in history, but really from a perspective of my maternal grandmother, the early Sephardic Jews that arrived, and my maternal grandfather, part of the earliest enslaved Africans to arrive to Rhode Island. So for me, my American story, American history is very rooted in being a part of the first families in every aspect. It's just that we didn't look like or worship like George and Martha Washington. And what's important about that is that there were many men, women, and families and children that lived, worked, and worshiped in early Rhode Island, early America, the early Americas, that didn't necessarily follow a majority Protestant Christian or majority Spanish domain. So this story here today, which we call American Irony, we developed it actually in two parts. We developed it initially about 8 years ago for Yale University as a part of their gallery in talking about unique aspects of the early founding of New England. And they asked me to come in and talk about the fact that many of the Yale divinity graduates who went on to become great colonial ministers were also actively engaged in slave trading and slave ownership. So for them, they had to get their minds around how did that be? How could that be? The second part was, over the last 2 years, I was asked by the city of Providence, the mayor of Providence, to help design and develop a comprehensive reparations investment strategy. Providence became one of a number of cities. We're actually the first city to actually set dollars aside and come up with a very specific and comprehensive investment strategy. In doing that, I was initially asked to come in and put together a consortium of historical institutions and develop almost what we eventually called the matter of truth, an assessment on this history. And in this report, which is about 300 pages, we'll have a second edition coming out soon, we basically and comprehensively documented over 3.5 centuries of racialized discrimination, literally from 1620 running up to about 2020. We had about 700 primary, secondary footnotes and sources. And that in itself has become an asset because now we have scholars all across the country reaching out to us, having access to our sources. But more importantly, other now communities contemplating reparations are asking us the question, how do you design and develop a process? And it starts with history. It starts with historical truth. It starts with the facts so that we're all on a level playing field and understanding of how we've arrived to where we are today, socially, culturally, racially, religiously. And this A Matter of Truth report we designed provides that. So what I'm going to do today for about 35 minutes is go through about 300 years of history. Please forgive me if I rush through it. I'll make sure I leave my cards. If you want to email me, I can give you access to bibliographies, further reading, further research. We love sharing this information that we have uncovered or really recovered. So let me begin with what I think the motto of Rhode Island is. Rob touched on the fact that we're very proud here in the colony of Rhode Island, later the state of Rhode Island, that we were settled, founded, at least founded from a European perspective, under the principles of religious freedom. But I'm going to have to qualify that because that's not really accurate. It's really more of an interpretation of what was not religious freedom. It was really religious freedom if you were a Protestant Christian male in the 17th century, a very important difference. And the irony is that this colony, as it's established, would attract literally all of the persecuted religious minorities across the world at that time. In fact, the first and earliest Quaker establishment is not Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, it's Newport in Rhode Island. Newport in Rhode Island had the largest Quaker settlement in the 17th century, well before Pennsylvania is established. And in fact, today, Newport still has In fact, today, Newport has one of the oldest existing Quaker meeting houses dating to 1698 in Newport, along with the oldest existing synagogue, along with the oldest existing earliest black church. So this all isn't a coincidence. This is all because these persecuted religious minorities had no place to go but Rhode Island. The irony later on is that they all actively participate and dominate the transatlantic trade or the African trade. So you have this irony of men, women, and families who understand firsthand the persecution of their religion, and then they almost immediately engage themselves in chattel property and succeed in it. In fact, the earliest participants in the transatlantic slave trade and slave ownership in New England are Quakers. My late grandmother had a saying about Quakers in Newport: 1 foot in the counting house and 1 foot in the meeting house. So it's important to recognize that as we begin talking about the early stages of this irony of religious freedom alongside enslavement, it's important to understand how those systems evolved and how people interacted at that time and discussed that issue. Before doing that, I really want to compliment the great work of the Tomcom Museum and the work that they're doing in really reestablishing the important history of the indigenous people of this region and across this country. But I think it's important to recognize that possibly the most defining event in the settlement of the early Americas, which is ironic today as we're still trying to slowly move away from the COVID pandemic, is the first pandemic. Between 1616 and 1619, that 3-year period before Massachusetts Bay Colony is established, before there are fixed permanent settlements, that 3-year period, you've got European explorers coming from Spain, the French, Portugal, Dutch, and they're all landing across the Atlantic seaboard. And as they land, they're interacting with coastal indigenous tribes. From Maine to Cape Cod, they were counting at that time well over 500,000 men, women, and families of indigenous living in those coastal areas between Maine and Cape Cod. Within that 3-year period of time, and then over the next several years as permanent settlements are being established, nearly every indigenous man, woman, and child died because of their lack of susceptibility to these European-born diseases. So if you think in terms of what was going on in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Black Death, the Middle Ages, pestilence, that was another reason why people were fleeing Europe and looking for fresh space, fresh land, fresh air. Unwittingly, they brought with them their disease, along with their cattle and farms and such. So that great dying, as it's called, would have devastating consequences and would literally wipe out most of the indigenous populations along the coastal areas, paving the way for free and clear settlement. What's fascinating about that is what the actual European colonizers or settlers were saying at that time. And what's fascinating is that some of the earliest members of the settlements in Massachusetts and Connecticut and later Rhode Island colony with Roger Williams saw themselves as being directed by the divine hand of God. God has freed us from the tyranny of England and brought us to the land of milk and honey in the Americas. And in fact, the initial representation of New England is not called New England, they call it English Israel. They see themselves as Protestant Christian men, women, and families, and actually align themselves to the Old Testament of the Bible, that as Jews were freed from the tyranny and slavery of Egypt and brought to the land of milk and honey by the hand of God, we are brought by the hand of God to the land of milk and honey, which is the Americas. And under this belief system, they believed that they not only had a right to worship freely in this new land, they also had the right under God in divine intervention to take the land and use the land and build upon the land and cultivate the land. So you have these very pious, religious men, women, and families arriving. They achieve something they could never achieve under the old European system, worshiping God without having a king or a queen or a royal governor looking over your shoulder, or not worshiping on anyone. But they also felt that they had a divine right to seize the land, cultivate the land, develop the land, and manage the land. And that would create a system of significant devastation for the indigenous people. Those indigenous people that somehow were able to starve off disease and death, those that moved into the interland, would now be forced and faced with new English policies that allowed the English to seize land, farm the land, cultivate the land, fence off the land, and completely isolate the surviving indigenous people. And that would create two sets of pushback wars, the Pequot Wars in the 1630s and the King Philip Wars here in Rhode Island in the 1670s. In both cases, surviving indigenous men that survived those wars, the English settlers came together and formally sent them enslaved to the West Indies, largely Barbados and Bermuda. I've had the chance to do scholarship work in Barbados, Bermuda, everywhere in the West Indies, and to see records, 17th century records of indigenous people landing in Bridgetown, Barbados, and then working side by side and sharing the same space of newly arriving enslaved Africans, and alongside indentured Irish servants, all within Barbados, all coming and connecting together. So it's important to recognize that the very settlement, the very founding of New England generally, but particularly Rhode Island, starts with this religious impulse, and then by the end of the 17th century, it moves very rapidly into land and land cultivation and wealth building, and it's happening almost simultaneously. And you know, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a Rhode Islander. In fact, in Rhode Island, we recognize the fact that our settlers, Roger Williams, Ann Hutchinson, John Clark, would settle and establish, as Rob said, coming across the Seekonk River, would be able to establish themselves and settle initially Providence, and then later as the colony of Rhode Island would include Portsmouth and Newport on Aquidneck Island, which again should actually be Rhode Island. So by the end of the 1630s, you have 4 solid towns being established in the colony of Rhode Island, and you have, most importantly, by 1663, actually July 2nd, King Charles II delivers a charter that was largely drafted by John Clark of Newport, who spent nearly 2 years in England negotiating and drafting that charter. But the charter comes back, it establishes us now as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. We've only recently removed plantations. But what's most important is in that charter, there is specific language that recognizes, we call our lively experiment, an experiment that there'll be no single religion dominating the people, and particularly the citizens of this colony. There would be a separation of church and state. All the things that we now are still defending and fighting over was being established in the colony of Rhode Island by those early settlers. And it's important to recognize that. But if you read the charter very carefully, it's very specific. To be a free citizen, you also have to accept the light being Jesus Christ. You have to be an accepted Protestant Christian. So it's important to recognize that even when the Quakers arrived by 1657, Roger Williams himself got in a canoe and rowed all the way down Narragansett Bay to Newport to debate them, saying, I don't want these heretics. I never intended to have heretics such as Quakers or Shakers. A year later, in 1658, Jews arrive from Barbados, and they actually asked the question, can we remain? We're not Protestant Christian, can we remain? In the next several years, in fact, the Rhode Island legislature in 1684, we have the original act, actually stated that Israelites can remain in the colony as long as they are obedient to His Majesty's laws and wills. But it also goes on to say, as alien inhabitants, not as citizens. So it's important to recognize that this establishment of religious freedom, yes, if you're a Protestant Christian male, no if you're anyone else. But it's important to recognize in the 17th century, just a place where you weren't going to be persecuted because of your religious beliefs is a good thing. So the early Jews that arrived and others that arrived weren't looking for freedom and naturalization and citizenship and voting rights. They were just looking for a place where they were not looking over their shoulder. And that's exactly what the colony of Rhode Island was able to offer. And that's exactly how Quakers, Jews, the Baptist faith, the Anabaptist faith, all begin to take rise in the 17th century. And we're proud of that. And in fact, you'll see a number of religious statements that still are related to Rhode Island where people are talking actively, as activists, about how important it is for us to be this independent state, for us to allow and engage anyone and tolerate anyone regardless of their religious proclivity. Connecticut actually called us Rogues Island and petitioned the Massachusetts colony to join them in taking back property because it was just so out of control in the concern that we're a colony of heretics. But Connecticut was not able to take control. Rhode Island would grow and prosper. And in fact, to this very day, some of the earliest congregations in the Christian community and the earliest existing place of worship for the Jewish community still exist in places like Newport and Providence. In fact, in Newport, I'm very proud to the fact that Newport has more colonial original structures than any city in America. That's including Philadelphia, Charleston, and Boston. Now, Newport with a year-round population of 25,000 people, but we have close to 400 original structures dating back to the pre-American Revolution colonial era, including institutions such as Touro Synagogue, the Quaker Meeting House, our Brick Marketplace, our Colony House, which is the 4th oldest state capitol building. These are all a part of the landscapes of Rhode Island generally, but particularly here on the east side of Providence and certainly most of Newport. And I just want to point out that, one of the most important things that I'm going to give you an inside hint if you ever visit Newport, because someone who's run the Chamber of Commerce, been on the City Council, been involved in every historic aspect, it's always interesting when visitors come to our community and what they see, what pictures they take and such. But one of the things about Newport that's important is John Clark, one of our founding European settlers, the person who had the greatest hand in drafting that charter, felt very strongly that there should not only be a separation of church and state in government, but physically there should be a separation of church and state. And if you've ever visited, or if you're from an old New England township, you almost always see a town center or a village green. And in that town center, the infrastructure is laid out in a way where at the top of the center is usually the dominant place of worship. Congregational church, Anglican church, certainly not a synagogue, certainly not a Quaker Meeting House. But you usually have that dominant place of worship at the top, standing down and looking down on the town. And then you have your town center. And then if you're a waterfront community, you're connected to a marketplace and your wharfs in the waterfront. That's a standard practice. And to have that church, largely Christian church at the center, at the top, makes a clear indication of who the leading religious groups are, who the leading families are. John Clark would have none of that. And as Newport was being laid out, our town center, which is today Washington Square that you can see there, at the very top of the square is our Colony House, our government building. At the bottom is our marketplace. And then everything surrounding it are homes of merchants and businesses. As meeting houses and eventually synagogues were being built in the 17th and 18th century, they all had an agreement that they would not build themselves within the town center, but in fact in a semicircle around the town circle equally, and not any one of them would have an outward sign of religion or religious identity. So no crosses. In fact, if you look at the Anglican church, some of the Baptist church that remain, the weather vanes on the top are not crosses, they're ships, they're whales, they're codfish. In fact, we don't see stained glass windows until the Irish and then later Portuguese and the Catholics arrive and start to introduce that. So what's important to recognize is that you've got a physical infrastructure in town where people feel that we are equal and that no one place of religion is dominating. And that's pretty special and that's pretty neat. And I always love to show this slide here because in 1976, I just started high school, and the bicentennial, Trinity Anglican Church, our church, my grandmother converted to, one of the oldest Anglican parishes in the country. Our organ is actually a gift from Handel himself. I mean, it's a very special place. The church itself was completed in 1720. But what's most important is it sits in an area that today is recognized as Queen Anne Square. In 1976, as a part of the bicentennial, Queen Elizabeth was coming to Newport. Queen Elizabeth was coming to the Anglican Church. Queen Elizabeth was going to sit and take part of a service. The leading women of that church, the leading women of Newport at that time, were very concerned with the fact that in front of the church were old homes, broken down, old warehouses, not very attractive. Mrs. Doris Duke led the effort. They raised money, and they took down every home. They created a town square. They actually removed colonial homes from other parts of the city and recreated for Queen Elizabeth and the visitors a traditional New England town center. So now every visitor comes to Newport, maybe you'll do this, will take a picture in Queen Anne Square in front of that church and go home and say, I was in an old colonial town center in Newport, Rhode Island. You know, we got you. That's for visitors. That's not the history. The history is no town center, relatively equality regardless of religion or ethnic or national background. So I just want to give you a sense of how Rhode Island was settled. You have early European colonists arriving, they're settling, they have this impulse to now worship freely. Many of them now are taking advantage of the wide-ranging land and with the urban ports, the access to ports and trade. And in fact, it's two very common denominators that are a part of the basic premise of the settlement of the Western Hemisphere. This could be a Rhode Island story, it could be a South Carolina story, it could be Jamaica, Barbados, Curacao, is two basic premises. Land is acquired from the indigenous people, and then enslaved Africans are used almost exclusively to cultivate and build upon that land. So by the middle of the 17th century, you begin to have a process where a colony is established, people are worshiping freely, now it's time to build business and cultivate an economy, and it's the transatlantic slave trade that is leading this economy. Again, here in New England generally, but particularly in Rhode Island, we have bad soil and bad weather. So for the most part, there's no cash crop economies. There's no agriculture-based economy. Most of our soil is sand and shale. We grow potatoes and corn, that's it. So most of our farms or plantations were largely animal husbandry or corn, or in some cases, potato raising, but nowhere near the level of commercial activities in cultivating products such as cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, coffee. That's not happening here. So for the most part, it's important to recognize that because it's actually, and it's a Rhode Island colony that specifically reaches back to King Charles IV and suggests that we should start to enter in trading with some of the English colonies in the West Indies. At the same time that the Charter of Colony of Rhode Island was established, King Charles marries well, and more importantly, as a part of that dowry, is able to raise funds to establish the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company begins to become the English instrument to introduce slavery, slave trading, and the supply chain tied to slave trading across the English settlements. And it's important that you recognize this because this is all happening simultaneously. And it's Rhode Island that steps forward and takes full advantage of this. So when we talk about the very founding of Rhode Island in the Americas, it's based upon two simple premises: the taking and utilization of indigenous land, free land, and then the utilization of free African labor. I mean, I think we'd all have a great start for our ancestors if we had free land and free labor, right? And they did, and they took advantage of that, and they built a level of wealth that was unimaginable for that time. Some of the wealthiest families in all of the Americas are tied to the urban New England seaports of New London, Connecticut, Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Bristol, Rhode Island, Newport. And there's a paradox with this, and this is one of the first ones that I'd like to talk about is that, you know, I did say that there were two devastating indigenous wars, the Pequot Wars and the King Philip Wars. At the end of the King Philip Wars, Roger Williams, our early founder and settler, our champion of religious freedom and toleration, he comes together with another 30 townsmen and leaders of Providence. We know this because we have the original records. And they form a committee to dispose of the remaining indigenous men. And in fact, they set up a very intricate system of people can buy them, and then as long as they buy them and take them out of the colony. And they set up a system of children. In fact, indigenous women and children are placed into indentured servitude. Slavery is outlawed, so indentured servitude replaces enslavement. Indigenous children are seized and taken from families, placed into indentured servitude, and separated from families. So it's important to recognize that these early settlers, these early colonizers, largely men and women who were persecuted as religious minorities, now become the persecutor. And now become, because of necessity, their manifest destiny of owning and controlling the land and building lives for people who look like and worship themselves. That stage is set very early in the 17th century. So it's always interesting to me being a New Englander when people talk about slavery and they talk about the antebellum South and have no idea that the origins of slavery and slave trading has as much in New England roots as in any other place in America today. And I just want to begin to talk about how the Africans arrived, because one of the things I've been able to do in working with scholars and actually traveling across the diaspora is actually we now have put together a comprehensive database of every documented slave voyage that has Rhode Island ownership. So between 1705 and 1807, we've documented 934 slave voyages from Rhode Island to West Africa, and from West Africa through the Middle Passage to the West Indies and back to Rhode Island. Out of that 934, I can tell you that my town of Newport dominates. It's about 72%. In fact, today what we call the transatlantic trade, or the triangular trade, is simply taking made products from New England and then transporting them to West Africa and then trading for enslaved Africans who in turn shipped to the West Indies to be the labor force in largely sugar plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, Bahamas, most certainly Jamaica. And then in those sugar plantations, the raw materials that are cultivated and harvested, sugar and molasses, are transported back to places like Newport and distilled into rum. And in fact, as I'd said, having an actual document of these voyages is chilling because we have ship logs, we have ship records, we have the numbers of Africans that traveled. In fact, one of the more interesting aspects of this is we are settled here in British North America as an English colony. We're not Spanish, French, or Portuguese, Dutch, so we're English. So it's logical to think that the English trading would be in English trading colonies. So in the West Indies, it's Barbados, it's Jamaica, and in West Africa, it's what they call the Gold Coast. Today, northern Nigeria, all of Ghana, and running into Guinea. And it's that Gold Coast where many of the Rhode Island ships would land. In fact, as you see here, out of the 934 or so, 72% come from Newport. In fact, Newport, during the colonial era, meaning the years leading up to the American Revolution, was the largest and most active slave trading port in the entire British North America. It's Newport. And Newport merchants were very smart. They actually understood the trade markets and the demands within the labor force. And they would introduce enslaved Africans from Sierra Leone to the Carolinas and the Georgia coast, and they would become a part of the rice cultivation economy. Now, why did Rhode Island merchants figure this out? Well, they figured it out because they found that as they were landing in Sierra Leone, in Bunce Island off the coast of Sierra Leone, they found that those indigenous Africans were some of the greatest rice cultivators and technologists the world had ever seen. So taking that technology and bringing it to New England would have no use or no value because we're not cultivating rice or anything here. But to bring it into the Charleston markets and the Savannah markets had great value. So you have this incredibly astute interconnectivity between Rhode Island merchants and the West African coast, the West Indies, and back to the Americas, all dominated by this trade. And the amount of wealth that was amassed in that fairly short period of time, 100-year period of time, is significant. And in fact, John Brown of Providence, John Brown would go on to be the namesake of Brown University, originally the College of Rhode Island. John Brown was a failed trader. He involved himself in about a half dozen trades, never very successful. In fact, one, the Sally, which is well documented, was a disaster. But in any case, he's writing to his brother, Moses, who breaks away from the family and becomes an active abolitionist, and states, it's Newport. I mean, I'm here in Providence, and I'm interacting with a number of Boston merchants. But if you want to go where the action is of slave trading and slave ownership and connectivity and where the wealth is, it's Newport, Rhode Island. And in fact, the business of slavery in Rhode Island is solely tied to the rum trade. Rhode Island merchants, when they landed in the West African coast, they did two things that were unique in transatlantic slave trading. One, they used as the trading commodity for human beings rum, hogshead barrels of rum. This is actually from the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. They have a whole collection of 18th century hogshead barrels of rum, empty, unfortunately, but hogshead barrels of rum. So Rhode Island merchants would trade directly with African tribal leaders. At that time, it's the Akan-speaking people, which still dominates today much of Ghana, and the Fanti coastal leadership, and they would trade directly with Rhode Island merchants, largely Newport merchants, in rum. They actually call them rum men. They're known as the rum men. And it's rum that's a trading commodity that's traded to take, own, and then transport enslaved Africans to a lifetime of enslavement working on sugar plantations, which, by the way, the average life expectancy of an 18th century sugar plantation in the West Indies was 6 months. Thus, the demand for more and more slaves. They're always continually demanding more slaves. And the Rhode Island merchants had no problem filling that demand. And what's fascinating about that is that, and I just want to point this out because in 1764, the English were really starting to reel on the wars that they were fighting. Great Britain was fighting wars in every front, the French, the Spanish, and they had the devastating French and Indian War here in the Americas. They were looking to raise money. King George was broke. So Parliament instituted a series of taxes, stamp tax, sugar tax, tea tax. We know this well because it was those taxes that would literally, taxation without representation, that would initiate an American Revolution. In 1764, Rhode Island Governor Josias Linden of Newport sends a letter to the British House of Trade, and we have that letter, and he talks in detail about the fact that, as you can see here, our little colony is like 30 miles. We have no productive cultivated earth. We are totally, totally dependent upon the sugar trade and the molasses trade and rum distilling. And in fact, we introduced rum to the West African coast and supplanted the French and French brandy. So Britain needs to reward us, not tax us. Because in 1764, as the governor says, there are 24 rum distilleries on the Newport waterfront alone. Newport had 24, Providence had 6, Bristol had 4. Together, Rhode Island was dominating about 80% of the Guinea rum market in the world market, 80%. So it's this, again, this focus on trade and focus on the transatlantic trade that begins to draw in these Rhode Island merchants who were all part of persecuted religious minorities only several generations before. And I just want to point out something important here, because a lot of the work that I do, and let me just step back for a second, because we're talking about slavery. Slavery is not black history. And I'm going to say it again later, but I want you to listen to this. Slavery is not black history. Black history is how our African heritage ancestors survived and thrived despite slavery. So one of the things that I've been honored to do is to work across the diaspora with African heritage scholars in the University of West Indies, University of Cape Coast, and have access to the African heritage perspective at that time. So I've been able to now recreate not the life of a slave, but the life of African heritage men, women, and children. And in fact, one of the things that we now know is that most of the Rhode Island ships that would land in the Gold Coast, generally, what is today recognized as Ghana, landed at 2 very important slave fortresses. One is called the Cape Coast Castle, very near the capital of Accra, and the second, about 30 kilometers to the north, is Fort William at Ananabo. In fact, Fort William at Ananabo is the most active slave trading castle for not only Rhode Island, but later Massachusetts, Connecticut merchants. My own ancestor came from Ananabo in the Fonte tongue, and then taken to Jamaica. And then eventually from Jamaica, her son is taken to Philadelphia, Newport by 1795 as an 8-year-old child, and moved from slavery to indentured servitude. So it's important to recognize that by traveling back and understanding the stories of the people, you get a much better understanding of the survivability and how Africans survived at that point, and its lessons for today, and how we might recognize the importance of survival. Now, one of the things that the Akan people did then, and they do to this very day, if you're a child born, you're given a day name based on the day of the week that you're born, or you're given a birth order name, or sometimes another descriptive name. My ancestor that survived the Middle Passage of Jamaica to Philadelphia, Newport, his name was Otaba, which phonetically becomes October. But Otaba means to stay put, which he had not. If you're a boy that's born on Friday, your name is Kofi, K-O-F-I. Phonetically, or we anglicize that into Cuffy. There are thousands and thousands of Cuffys and Cuffs all across colonial Rhode Island. There are millions in Jamaica. So one of the most important aspects of understanding this history is that we have now tracked with primary documents, meaning diaries, letters written by Africans from slavery to freedom, where they not only maintain in some cases, later when they become free, they reclaim their day name and pass it on to their children. And I can't tell you how exciting this is when you travel in the diaspora and present this history, because all of a sudden, kids are saying, geez, we're not talking about slaves anymore, we're talking about real people and culture and heritage and religion. And geez, you're telling me, Mr. Stokes, that I'm a part of the Akan people of West Africa? I had no idea of that. And I hear that same response when I'm in downtown Newport with kids of color or Kingston, Jamaica with kids of color. All of a sudden, history becomes important to them because it becomes humanized, it becomes real. And I've been able to document and assemble, and this is just a small snapshot of the thousands of names of Africans, not African Americans, not like myself, not African Americans, Negroes, black, people of color, BIPOC, whatever is used, Africans. And in fact, there's this unique aspect as how Africans arrive. When they arrive here, particularly in Rhode Island, what sets it apart with African arrivals and African enslavement elsewhere, not better or worse. I don't want you to get a sense that history is in black and white. It's always shades of gray. But when the Africans that arrived here you have three very unique conditions. One, many of the European settlers that arrived here, settled here, were pious, religious believers. They understood discrimination firsthand from their religion. So religion was very much a part of their life, the center of their life. Second, the trade economy here is not an antebellum South or not a West Indian plantation economy. So for the most part, there's no need for large numbers of strong men and women to work the fields. It wasn't a need. Most of the trades here as a part of a supply chain is literally tied to urban seaports. So think of all the work that's needed in an urban seaport. Boat makers, silversmiths, goldsmiths, barrel makers. All of that becomes a part of the dominant trades that are introduced to Africans. In fact, in colonial Rhode Island, and particularly Newport, African children are the highest priority. There are reams and reams of advertisements that we have. And in these advertisements, they're specifically stating to bring back, or we're bringing to, African children. The reason they're utilizing African children is simply based upon, one, the time it takes to learn a trade skill. You're 8, 9 years old. My ancestor was 8 years old. He is being trained as a Windsor chair maker and then later cabinet maker in Philadelphia and then Newport. Why? Because the great Quaker furniture makers are settled in Philadelphia, Newport. And that would be the demand. They didn't need him to work in a Philadelphia cotton field or a Philadelphia rice plantation. They didn't exist. So you have this unique circumstance where African children are coming into the community. Now, the fact that a child survives the Middle Passage, but they do, and I'm here to testify, they did. But more importantly, these African children almost immediately have access to trade skills, language skills, education skills. You see in Newport, Providence, Philadelphia, initially Quaker schools that are all set up to establish education and training and religious training and access to these African children. So what you have here in colonial New England generally, but specifically in places like Rhode Island and Newport, you have a unique circumstance where enslaved are living, working, and worshiping side by side, sharing the same spaces in close proximity of a master and mistress. But that's not integration. Let me be clear. That's not integration. It's interdependence. It was absolutely essential to have that slave boy learn a trade, pride a trade, build money for me, and we would use religion as a way to begin to manage our slave economy. So this introduction to religion, I want to be clear, largely because we're dominated by a Protestant Christian community, is not to simply introduce the pagan, enslaved African or indigenous person to the light or Christ and God. It was also a control mechanism. And in fact, it's a Quaker woman in Newport that makes this statement, so does a custom keep men blinded. Every religious denomination participated in the African slave trade. It is a false statement to single out any one religion, any one race, any one ethnicity. This was a worldwide 350-year economy that transported, at a minimum, 12.5 million men, women, and children from Old World to New World. So it's important to understand that in Newport's case, the slave traders, and I get this question all the time, particularly at Turtle Synagogue, Keith, Jews, slavery, slave trade, I can't understand this. And I have to be able to be clear to the fact that those few Jews who participated in the slave trade and slave ownership were merchant traders, like their Anglican, Baptist, Quaker counterparts. The lion's share of Jews in Newport were not merchant traders, were not wealthy, did not own or participate in the trade, as was the lion's share of Quakers and Anglicans. But the wealthy elite, the merchant class, were entirely tied to and benefiting from the transatlantic slave trade and the utilization of enslaved African children to provide all the supply chain work needed to support that industry. So that's important to recognize. And again, Joseph Wanton is one of our most famous Newport early settler families, earliest Quaker families, every generation is a Quaker. And this actually comes from Joseph Wanton in 1758 as he comes before the Quaker Meeting House and says, I have to disclose, I'm a slave trader, I'm a slave owner, I'm going to give you specific details where I'm landing in Ananabo and doing this work. And now I renounce, now that he's made his money, now that he has his social standing, he renounces the participation in the trade. It's always fascinating to me that certain religious groups, racial, ethnic groups, renounce racism, bigotry, and oppression once they got it made, once they've made their money. But that's okay. That's history. But possibly during that same time in the 1740s and 50s, in the Protestant Christian community, you see this Christian revival network begin to rise up. It starts in Virginia colony, but really takes root here in southern New England, influenced by Yale Divinity School in Connecticut and into Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And it's called the Great Awakening. And in the Great Awakening, it's this Christian revival where your relationship with God is not only through Jesus Christ, and not only from being pious and going to church or a meeting house, it's also what you do on a day-to-day basis. You have to actively demonstrate that you are a good person and you're spreading the gospel. You're spreading the word of Christ. So you have this massive conversion of indigenous people and enslaved Africans. In fact, some of the records that we have are astounding because we look at 18th century records and you're talking about hundreds and thousands of Africans being converted in a year-to-year basis. And the clergy are competing with each other. Reverend Samuel Hopkins is writing letters of the First Congregational Church and competing with Reverend Honeyman of the Anglican Church in Newport and saying, I had 300 in service, I have 400. So what's important to know is that this access to religion is simply to meet the pious needs of the Great Awakening that we're sharing Christ. But it's also, when you begin to read the sermons and interact with how they were interacting with the Africans and indigenous, it's a tool of control. They're reminding them, as it says in the Bible, servants, be good to your master, as we are all good and obedient to our God. In fact, what's fascinating about that is that you've got now thousands of Africans enslaved, some free, all worshiping within all the major denominations. Now, they're in the back of the worship. They're in the back pews. In Trinity Anglican Church, we have a set of row pews in the back called nursing pews because nursing mothers and children, who wanted to disturb the services, would sit in the back. Well, Africans were sat in the back of meeting houses, sat in the back of places. We have 6 Africans listed as Israelites and living and working in Jewish households. So what's important to recognize is that they have access to religion, but they really aren't a part of that. They're really not enjoying and actively engaged in worshiping and expressing their belief in God, in the religion that they chose, or religion that they were brought in to choose to. And in fact, I get this question all the time. How did Christian, Jewish, religious leaders, pious people reconcile owning a slave? How did they do that? Well, it's simple. You read the letters and documents at that time. Their belief system at that time, dating back to the 17th century with indigenous people, is we only own your labor. Here on earth, we own your labor, and we have every right to own your labor. But once we convert you through the light, through Christ to God, God owns your soul. And when you die and I die, together we'll be together equally with God. But now that we're on earth, I own your labor, be obedient to me, and I have every right to take your labor, take your land, and build a life for myself and my family. Now, that's a 17th, 18th century rationale. I'm not here to say that's good, bad, or indifferent, but it's how people rationalize. And if you read the diaries and records of Governor Winthrop and Innocent and Cotton Mather and Roger Williams, they're consistently making that same statement. But it's important to recognize that the African community understood this irony. This gentleman here is one of my Newport ancestors. He was the first man of color to be a state representative in Rhode Island in 1885. He later became, he's a man of the cloth. He later became ambassador to the West Indies during the Spanish-American War. But in 1887, he wrote a narrative as part of a sermon called The Future of the Negro in Rhode Island. And he talks about, as you can see here, the fact that as a Negro, as we were called, our landing in early America was not to achieve religious, certainly not racial, religious opportunity. In fact, it was used against us. It was used to maintain us. And he talks about that. This is a first-person Rhode Island African-American man talking in 1887 about this irony. And he writes extensively about that. And he's preaching extensively about that with other black clergy in New England at that time. So we as New Englanders of African descent, we're happy to be here. We're proud to be a part of the Southern New England and the great experiment and the live experiment. But we also have to raise a hand and say it wasn't quite like that for our ancestors. And it's important that you know that, and it's important that you recognize that also in history books. And I just want to give you some individual bios of some of the paradox that was going on at this time again, with both Christian and Jewish leaders and merchants and such. But this one is one of my most interesting because I've done a lot of writing about this, and I own some personal items from the Turrell family and from the Lopez family and Meyer family. And Isaac Eliezer, along with Aaron Lopez, were two of the leading merchants, two of the leaders of Congregation Jesuit Israel that later in 1763 for Hanukkah, December 2nd, would finish the completion of what is today Turrell Synagogue. They're leaders in the community. Aaron Lopez specifically, he is a Sephardic Jew. The family began in Seville, Spain, and then with the Inquisition were pushed into Portugal. Then they spent several generations living as conversos. The better term, more accurate term is Marrano, because they maintained their Jewish identity and religion despite their outward appearance of being Catholics. And then Aaron Lopez, along with his uncle and other brothers, left Portugal and came directly to Newport and would establish themselves as significant merchant traders. In fact, in a 10-year period, Aaron Lopez becomes one of the wealthiest merchants in America. He has investments in over 100 sailing vessels during his career. He's the second largest taxpayer in Newport. He's arrived. He introduces Newport to the China trade. Along with his uncle, he introduces Rhode Island to a spermaceti candle trade. In fact, I just want to step back and talk about that. Again, we can't grow anything here. So it's all about supply chain, aftermarket production. These are very entrepreneurial men, women, and families. Well, as the Jews arrived, particularly those Jews coming from the Iberian Peninsula, one of the things they arrived with is the fact that, you know, your candles are made through beeswax. Well, we're going to introduce you through the Azores of another technique of candle making using the pussy brain matter of spermaceti whales. And lo and behold, the spermaceti whale brain matter, it's a dirty business. These whales were drawn into Newport, not into the town, but Goat Island, a small island off the coast of Newport. Today it's a resort and hotels. At the time, that's where they were dragging these carcasses of whales, carving out the brain matter, boiling it, and then curing it into candles. Spermaceti candles were the ever-ready battery of the 18th century. They burned longer with no smoke as compared to beeswax and other materials. Providence Christian merchants led by the Brown and Steele family and the Jewish merchants of Newport came together and formed in 1764 the first United States business cartel, the United Spermaceti Candle Making Company. And they dominated that trade. As they dominated and owned the rum trade, they dominated and owned the spermaceti candle making trade. A Josias Lucina, Sephardic Jew, cousin to the Lopez family, arrives, converts to become an Anglican, then leaves to Savannah, Georgia. But before doing that, he creates and establishes a patent for Castilian soap making, and only within Newport. Later, as this sugar tax comes into fruition, Aaron Lopez, his uncle, Jacob Ruiz Rivera, says, we've got to do something to replace sugar. It's too costly for us. We've got to make a statement. So they introduced cocoa beans and chocolate to the American colonies. And it's the Jewish merchants in Newport utilizing enslaved Africans as chocolate grinders. We have the records. And partnering with the Brown family in Providence in creating a cartel in chocolate making. So what's important to understand here is that these merchants have arrived, they're unique, they're entrepreneurial, they're building a place to worship freely and a place to live freely and to live quite well. And Isaac Eliezer and Aaron Lopez, they make the decision, you know, we've been here for years, we're taxpayers for here, we're good citizens, and thank you for being tolerated, but I think the time has come for us to be full citizens. We'd like to petition to become naturalized citizens. And they go before the Rhode Island General Assembly at Newport, at the Colony House, and they make the request, you know, we're good citizens, we do all these great things, we would like to become citizens. And the Rhode Island General Assembly says, no, you cannot. The Charter of 1763 is specific. It is for Protestant Christians. You are not Protestant Christian. But keep paying taxes, keep employing people, keep the economy going. You just can't be a citizen. Both Eliezer and Lopez would twice petition, twice be denied. Both of them actually went to the Massachusetts Bay Colony to become naturalized. But what's ironic is at that same time that they're fighting for their religious freedom and identities, Eliezer is posting ads in the Newport Mercury newspaper for the return of his runaway enslaved African woman. Aaron Lopez owned 12 enslaved Africans. They're doing everything within his household. They're chocolate grinders, they're shipwrights, they're shipmates. I mean, it's incredible the number of enslaved that they had in their households, like other merchant class at that time. And I think one of the most paradoxical persons of that time is Reverend Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles today is recognized as one of the early presidents of Yale University. Ezra Stiles is one of the Renaissance men of early colonial Newport. He's a founder of the Redwood Library, which is the oldest lending library still existing. Philadelphia would disagree, but I think we're close, 1-2. Stiles becomes so enamored with the newly arriving Jewish community, he spends most of his time interacting with some of the Jewish merchants and leaders. In fact, since before there was a permanent place of worship, high holy days and such was done in the large merchant homes, Lopez Rivera's, Eliezer, other homes. Ezra Stiles becomes so enamored because in his belief, I will have a better understanding of our Old Testament by talking to, as he says in his diary, old world Israelites. And there are not rabbis, but religious leaders running through the town on a consistent basis. The most important one, who is a rabbi, is Isaac Carrigal. Isaac Carrigal in the 18th century is probably recognized today as the most important wandering Jew of the Western Hemisphere. He literally goes to every Jewish settlement in the Western Hemisphere. He's in Barbados, Curacao, Jamaica, Newport, New York, and he's bringing religion, he's bringing stability. He helps to set up the shul. He actually helps to invite other rabbis. In fact, Isaac Turrell, who arrives at age 20, is invited by Isaac Carrigal. Isaac Turrell is a long line of rabbis from Spain. In fact, they're from an area in Galicia that's called Turrell. That's why his name is Isaac de Abraham Turrell. And it's this Isaac Carrigal that says, you got to come to Newport. You got to help set up. He didn't even complete his rabbinical studies. He came here several years out, but they wanted him here. They wanted him to be a part of it. And he arrives here. So what's important about understanding that is that Jewish Christian leaders are coming together, they're interacting interdependently and living a significant life as merchant class traders in wealth, but doing this on top of indigenous land and enslaved African labor. And I just want to point out probably the most important clergy at that time who begins to challenge the issues of slavery, Reverend Samuel Hopkins. Reverend Samuel Hopkins is a counterpart of Ezra Stiles. They're all Yale Divinity graduates. Samuel Hopkins would arrive in 1770. We know this because our family actually owns his installation sermon. Ezra Stiles provided the sermon in 1770. The reason our family owns this is because Ezra Stiles was literally the first active abolitionist in America. He's writing letters to the editor. He demands that everyone that's in his church to either leave the trade or leave his church, they all pick up and leave his church and go to Ezra Stiles' church. He believes that Africans are not only fellow human beings, but should have all the rights of fellow human beings. In 1774, he gets Stiles and John Witherspoon, who is a minister and also president of the College of New Jersey, Princeton today, and he actually recruits several Africans to be trained to enter the college, the first time in history Africans entering college, to be trained as missionaries to return to the West Indies and West Africa to extend the gospel. In fact, the three Africans he selected are Phyllis Wheatley of Boston, who's well known today as one of the first, if not the first, African poets in the country, and then a Bristol Yama and a John Comino of Newport. Phyllis Wheatley turns it down, saying she's too sickly, which she was. But John Comino and Bristol Yama would travel and would learn and become the first two Africans to enroll. So I just want to end here with, I think, why this is important, but most importantly, how this ties in today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the issues of racial tension. And it really dates back to something that is not tied to what we celebrated last week, Juneteenth. I think everyone talks about Juneteenth, and most people really didn't realize what Juneteenth was maybe a year or two ago. But in reality, Juneteenth is not the official celebration of African emancipation and slavery. It was for Texas in 1865. But well before that, starting in 1777, and over the next 10 years, every New England and northern now state, they're moving from colony at the end of the American Revolution to state, either immediately or gradually abolishes slavery. This first emancipation would create a group of people who had never existed before, free African heritage people. So in places like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, New Hampshire, you've got scores of free African heritage people who have access to education and language. They have trade skills. They're actually more literate than the white larger community and the newly arriving immigrants who begin to arrive in the early 19th century, Germans and Irish. So they begin to form and establish their first institutions. The first free black churches and civic organizations in America are not Savannah, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, Mobile, Alabama. They're in Boston, Philadelphia, Newport, and Providence. And we know this because we have the records. In fact, each of these African communities would form their own African societies, and each and every one would evolve into a church. And today, the earliest free black churches in America, two of the earliest, are the Cogden Street Baptist Church here in Providence, that still exists, and the Union Colored Congregational Church in Newport. In Philadelphia, it would be the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first of its kind. In Boston, the African Meeting House would evolve into a Baptist church. And again, we know this because we have their diaries and letters. And what's really neat for me is that these African early founders of America are all interacting and talking about how do we exchange ideas about being free, having schools, having churches, worshiping freely. How do we create an America for ourselves? And this is going on not in 1867 in Reconstruction era South. This is going on in 1790, 1795, 1800. In fact, one of the great physical ironies for me is living in Newport, which I love dearly, is that the earliest free African communities, free meaning men and women that lived there were free, they owned their own homes, they owned their businesses, they had their own places of worship. It's the historic Hill of Newport, College Hill of Providence, and Beacon Hill in Boston. Today, people of color could barely afford to walk through there. But the early history, most of the buildings and infrastructure that still exist on the north slope of Beacon Hill, that's why Joy Street, that's where the African Meeting House is. In Newport, it would be Bellevue Avenue, the historic hill. In Providence, it would be College Hill, which at one point they had names such as Mount Hope and Lippet Hill and Squaw Hollow. These were all early African heritage settlements with legacies that actually continued well into the 20th century. And you'd have to bring me back in a whole other presentation because in the 20th century, it's urban renewal policies that take down and deconstruct historically African heritage indigenous communities all across America. What James Baldwin in 1965, the poet, said, urban renewal is really Negro removal. And the Negro removal in New England was wiping out the legacy and ownership of African heritage people on College Hill in Providence, Beacon Hill in Boston, and Roxbury in Boston, and Historic Hill in Newport. So let me stop there. A lot of history in a short period of time. I'm certainly going to try to answer any questions you might have, but more importantly, I will leave a bibliography, and I'll leave a copy of this if anyone has any further discussions or questions or resources. Thank you.
First of all, thank you. I mean, this was incredibly
Please identify yourself, where you're from.
I'm Rabbi Andrew Sklarz. It's a pleasure to be here. This was incredibly enlightening, and thank you for sharing a great deal that I was not aware of. I think I was particularly, I mean, I was troubled by a great deal, but I was particularly intrigued when you talked about in states such as in the East Coast, the Northeast, when emancipation took place to a certain extent, and there were institutions and churches and so forth, which is wonderful for education. But was there any integration whatsoever? Were black people allowed to integrate with white people, to go in, or was it you live there and we live here and never the twain meets?
It's a complicated response. I like to use the term interdependence because when I think of integration, there's full-fledged integration. I mean, we're integrated by faith, by work, by families. You didn't have that level of interchange. In fact, in the 20th century in New England, you may not have had a Jim Crow policies like the South, but you had Jim Crow traditions. I mean, if you were African American in Providence in the 1930s and FDR was instituting billions of dollars to begin to build us out of this recession, and you had federal housing authorities being established, federal mortgage insurance programs being established, you were physically and racially redlined out of that. If you were African American, you could not qualify for a federally insured mortgage in the 1930s and 40s because you happened to live in a community that was redlined out. In Providence, and we have the 1935 map, every community that was redlined out for qualifying for federal mortgage insurance were predominantly black and limited income communities. So the reality is that New England may not have been as brutal. I mean, this is all based upon perception, or as recognized. New England still kept up a practice of separate and unequal, and it was significant. In fact, just a quick interesting story. My grandmother, the house that I live in, we've only owned for 5 generations, but it was an old farmhouse. And in 1917, you know, my grandmother, blonde hair, blue eye, very pretty woman, had 3 oldest kids. My mom wasn't even born yet. Wanted to buy a house. They're living in Newport, downtown. Nobody wanted to live downtown during the World War I eras because it's dirty and noisy and soldiers. So they wanted to buy a farmhouse out in the outskirts of Newport. My grandmother bought it and closed on the house and left her husband and 3 kids downtown and did not disclose. Fortunately, she's already an Anglican. Thank goodness they didn't realize she might have been Jewish or had a Jewish background. She bought the house. And then 2 years later, in 1920, they refinanced it under both their names. It's called creative survival. I mean, you do the things that you have to do based upon the times you live. And then just a second, I mean, stories are always nice because they're human. Just a second story tied to that. My grandfather, you know, who was a college graduate, my grandmother, they all went to college. They all had great access to education, did well. My grandfather, when he arrived in Newport as a young man, he became a part in 1898 of a men's club called the Ugly Man's Fishing Club. And the Ugly Man's Fishing Club was a very popular all-black professional men club. In the summer, black men of means would come up from Philadelphia, New York, down from Boston, come to Newport and fish. And I still have rods and reels and photographs from like the early 20th century of fishing and such. I can never tell you where it is because I'm not supposed to divulge the spots. But
What's the name of Ugly Man?
here's why. These men were college educated, they were prosperous, they had disposable incomes, and for whatever reason, they were not being asked to join the white clubs, the Spouting Rock Beach Association, which is today Bailey's Beach, the Reading Room private club, the private tennis club, the casino. So their inside joke was, well, I guess they don't want us because we have education and means of wealth. It must be because we're ugly. It's got to be because we're ugly. But the whole point of that is that they're not worried about integration. I can tell you, I have the letters and diaries of my great-grandfather, my great-uncle, they never talked about integration. I don't want to be a part of the Bailey's Beach. I don't want to be a part of your tennis club. We'll form our own tennis club, which we did. We'll form our own fishing club. We have our own place. We had our own literary society. You don't want us as members of Redwood Library? We'll hold our own literary society, have our own books. And most importantly, we don't want your daughters. We have our own love life, we have our own families, and we have our own choice. So what they're looking for is interdependence and freedom of choice, not integration. That's a fear that others have, that others put a place upon us. We just want a fair chance to survive and enjoy ourselves, thus the Ugly Man's Fishing Club.
I'm sorry we've run out of time. As you can tell why Keith has enamored 6 governors, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent, and have asked him to serve their cabinets. And this is why. He's truly gifted in this. And you know, I'd spend all day just listening to Keith. But we are on a bit of a schedule, Stephen reminds me, so I'm going to ask you to, Keith will stay a little bit for some private questions, and feel free to get his contact information and website information. And he's well published and is a resource for many scholars. I will point out there were a few pictures of the First Baptist Church. It was the high-spired white church that was built there, I think, in the mid-1700s. And we're having dinner tomorrow night at the University Club, and the dining room window where we're having dinner tomorrow night looks at the side of that church. We're right across the street tomorrow. So if you forget it, I'll point it out to you. And I think from those windows we can also see the Cogden Street church.
Yeah,
the
spire.
south side
You'll pick up a piece of it.
the first black meeting house, which is I think is now undergoing a renovation, a siding renovation. Keith, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen.